is what I think. It's important to point out that that when you have the early quotations of these Gospels, nobody identifies them as connected with anybody. And so, for example, you start getting quotations. They appear to be from the Gospels in the early 2nd century, with authors such as, at the end of the 1st century, first Clement quotes Gospels. Ignatius quotes Gospels. Polycarp quotes Gospels. Justin quotes Gospels. None of these they'll quote sayings, but they'll never say this. This is from the Gospel of Mark or this is the Gospel of Matthew. They never do that, and Papias doesn't do that either. And so it's very strange when you get down to Justin Martyr around the year 150 or so. Justin will refer to what appear to be our Gospels, but he doesn't call them by our Gospels. He calls them the memoirs. And in fact, the only memoir that he names is the memoir of Peter. He's talking about the Gospel of Peter. It's not until you get to Irenaeus in the year 180 or 185 that you have any author saying that the Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is the first time that we know that our Gospels go by this name. And so that's why a lot of scholars just don't think that these Gospels were given names. And I agree with Richard that the reason to give these names was to differentiate among them. It's only when you have multiple Gospels in a community that you need to differentiate which one is which. I don't think that it's necessarily the case that the author, that the community that was reading Luke also had Mark in front of it. It might have been the case. It might not have been the case. We have no way of knowing one way or the other. But to say that this gospel was called the Gospel according to Luke in, say, the year 90, I don't think that there's any evidence for that.
But you surely are not claiming that nobody had any way of distinguishing one gospel from another in what they called it until Irenaeus.
What it appears to be the case, I mean, if you simply look at what they say, if you see how First Clement quotes these books, or if you see how Ignatius deals with these books, or you see how Polycarp deals with these books, they don't do what you say they should be doing. They don't say, this is Mark's version, or this is Luke's version.
I didn't say that they should be doing that. I mean, what they are doing, of course, is mostly quoting sayings of Jesus, and for them the authority is Jesus himself, so they ascribe sayings of Jesus to Jesus himself. It's much less important.
But they also talk about incidents from the life of Jesus. I mean, for example, Ignatius talks about the birth of Jesus, and he doesn't tell us, so this is based on the account of the Gospel of Matthew. They don't identify these Gospels in ways that you're saying that they should have been doing.
Well, I mean, they're writing for Christian readers who are familiar with the Gospels they're referring to. It's like Jews referring to the law of Moses. They don't tell us it's in Genesis. They tell us it's what Moses said. Quite often the New Testament refers to something spoken by the prophet. And it turns out to be Isaiah, but they don't have to tell us that. Can I just
makes sense, except the later Christian authors do tell us this comes from Luke or this comes from Matthew. So there we know for certain that these authors had Gospels called Luke and Matthew.
Can I make
that you don't have evidence of that from the early sources until Irenaeus.
Can I just make a couple of points about this second century evidence? First of all, everybody, except you, Bart, thinks that Papias referred to the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. I mean, you actually think that these references are to a Gospel of Mark other than the one we know, and the Gospel of Matthew other than the one we know. But Papias certainly does refer to two Gospels which he ascribes to apostles or followers of apostles. The other point I want to make is on Justin, because I think you neglect the most interesting reference in Justin, where he says that the memoirs of the apostles were composed by the apostles and by their followers, by the apostles plural and by their followers plural. That tells us a good deal more about them than just the memoirs.
Yeah, well, and he thinks one of those was Peter.
That's not terribly clear. But in that particular case, he's thinking of more than one gospel ascribed to an apostle, and he's talking about gospels ascribed to followers of the apostles. What should we think of? Mark and Luke are the obvious references.
Well, no, that's not the obvious reference at all, because he doesn't call them Mark and Luke. He doesn't tell us which followers he's referring to. He's simply saying that there are gospels in circulation, some of them written by apostles and some by their followers. But first of all, there's absolutely no evidence that any of these gospels was actually written by any of the followers of Jesus, who were lower-class, Aramaic-speaking peasants from Galilee. So Justin, in fact, is not right about that. He's discussing these matters 80 years after the Gospels have been put into circulation. I don't see how you can use him for evidence that the Gospels were called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He doesn't even mention Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John.
We're talking about when did the Gospels acquire these names, and are you saying that Justin knew these Gospels, but he knew them as anonymous Gospels, and he ascribes them to followers of Jesus? What were these Gospels he knew called?
That's what I want to know. I don't think they were called anything in Justin's day.
How could they not be called anything? I mean, you had several.
You're used to calling these Gospels Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so you think, well, they've always been called that. In fact, the early authors don't call them those things. They're simply anonymous works floating around that people are saying, well, these must go back to followers of Jesus.
But a particular church community would have a library by the early 2nd century of a few books. 2 or 3 of them at least would be Gospels. How do they say, today we're going to read from this Gospel? They had to have
to a liturgical setting in your church where people get up and say, this is from the Gospel of Luke, and you're imposing that on the 2nd century. My question is, where is the evidence that they were called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John before Irenaeus?
Well,
that's the first time they're called by these names, and if you impose some names on them earlier, you're imposing it. You're not basing it on any evidence.
Okay,
that
one last thought from Richard, and we'll go to another break.
My point is that if those were not the names, what were they called? They had to be called something for obvious practical reasons, not imposing modern liturgical usage or anything. But if you've got several Gospels, you've got to have weight. It's inconceivable that they didn't call them anything. Did they call them Gospel 1, Gospel 2, Gospel 3? What did they call them?
We'll come